basis of the thoughts I want to present to you today and subsequently were laid in between about 1968 and 1975 and resulted in the first book I wrote called Approaches to the Mind, which is an attempt to gain a relatively broad grasp of psychological work in general, and psychiatric and psychotherapeutic work in particular. After that, I wrote 4 books, which were essentially in the nature of case explorations in an effort to define what specific psychological inventions were from the point of view of the schools, and then from more generally, and perhaps occasionally more originally. The last of those books is called Coming to Life, and that will come out in January and February of this coming year, 93. But the purpose of these comments today and subsequently is to draw conclusions from these case studies and this review of historical material of the background of the schools, and to suggest ways of working that spring out of those case studies and that review. Now, a project like this can only arise, I suspect, when there are serious questions, either in the author's mind or in general, serious questions about the prevailing paradigms. And so I want to start these remarks this morning by speaking about two of the two principal orthodoxies or paradigms that prevail in world psychiatry, in world psychology today, and trying to bring into focus the reasons that these paradigms invite questions, indeed invite replacement. I mean, of course, so-called medical descriptive disease psychiatry on the one hand and psychoanalysis on the other, as the two obvious central assays of organizing psychological work today. Now, the difficulties that the disease school gives us in a general psychological project are not very difficult to detail, in part because of the very clarity, the very frankness, you might say, with which descriptive psychiatry, disease psychiatry, goes at its task. For example, it depends in its investigations essentially on questions or interrogations, orders to the patient. It attempts to reach into the patient's mind as if it were an open receptacle and draw from it presumably reliable or at least useful information on which to base its symptom and syndrome collections, and then the formation of syndromes, and most ambitiously and most often failedly, the concept of diseases. When medical psychiatrists undertook the psychological project, they did it on the model of the medical project in general. That is, they assumed that the patient was more or less obedient, compliant, helpful, and of course they quickly bumped up against the limitations of that in our population, which by definition has some kind of communicative interpersonal difficulties, which makes such a direct project dubious at best. Now, as we know, this paradigm for psychological work, for medical psychological work, or for clinical psychological work, is riding high today. But I think we can already see what the very severe limitations of it are, and why, more specifically, it invites, if not a replacement, because we don't want to replace anything so much as to supplement it or to put each of the older schools into a place where it belongs, rather than allowing this kind of solitary ruling of the roost. But we see, for example, today a continuing proliferation of disease states, so that one is always discovering that there are arguments about whether such and such shouldn't be included. The same thing happened in the 19th century at the beginnings of descriptive psychiatry, when everything that seemed like a symptom was individually portrayed as a disease, hence the terms kleptomania, dipsomania, and the rest of it. And something like that is not quite at work here, but the proliferation of diseases, the determination of reliability, yes, in the process of disease recognition, but not validity. The fact that that one of the most basic hopes of the disease school, that one could ascertain what is tantamount to the disease concept in medicine, that is, one could ascertain physical substrates of the diseases, whether findings in the brain or chemical and physiological changes. This has been so far in psychiatry a disappointment, and no findings have emerged for any state which are really compelling in the general sense. Now, that doesn't mean they won't happen, but it suggests that there are limitations to this approach, which suggests that it at least needs supplementation. The largest charge, however, to be brought against descriptive psychiatry as a major psychiatric project is that it sharply separates the disease from the person. And although it speaks about character types, for the most part it throws down its hands when faced with the delineation of character. In other words, it tries to do it on a symptomatic basis, which quickly defeats it if you look at the efforts to separate the character disorders in the various DSM-3 things, in my opinion. So that even though it seems likely that there are diatheses, if not diseases, within the body of psychiatric concerns and clinical psychological concerns, although that seems very likely, it still leaves very much up in the air what the relationship of those are to the host. And so that even if we give a good deal of credit to the modern effort to devise symptomatic entities that might be responsive especially to medications, although we give some credit to that, we still have to confront the terrible limitations that come upon making that the central project, as long as the host factors or the personality factors are left in such an ambiguous position from that point of view. Furthermore, there is in the disease school a simplicity of mind, you might say, that not only offends the psychologically minded, but sends them almost as it were screaming from the room. For many of us, human beings are mysteries, and that even after the most prolonged psychological investigations, whether of a scientific kind or a therapeutic kind, for the most part we throw up our hands in terms of the finality of a decision. People are mysteries, and evidence of that is everywhere. Just let me mention one evidence, which is, it seems to me, if not decisive, surely throws the burden of confidence away from us, and therefore shadows the disease project. The biographies of even well-known people. People studied from many angles, often psychologically, often psychotherapeutically, about whom enormous amounts of information is collected, are nevertheless left with mysterious aspects which invite another biographer to take an often contrary point of view. And this goes on, decade after decade, century after century, in fact. So that the nature of personality, its defining factors, what gives us a sense of certainty about it, eludes us. It eludes us. So that if a psychological view of patients in particular, which is our coming together point here under psychotherapy, a psychological view of patients that does not put somewhere near the center of the enterprise that mystery, does not allow for it, does not give it to us as a fact which we have to acknowledge rather than deny, that project seems to me, if not fatally flawed, at least should come up against the most radical skepticism. Now, we all are very conversant with the way in which Freud and psychoanalysis in general attacked this project. Its clarity is not so much a function of any easy answers, which is sometimes a weakness in the descriptive school, but of the extraordinary reach and penetration of Freud's mind and his capacity to conceptualize psychological matters with a decisiveness which is certainly without parallel in the history of our work. And So that when I speak about what I think the limitations of psychoanalysis are as a general model for our work, I don't want to get into a partisan discussion which seems to depreciate the extraordinary achievements and the sophistication, above all the psychological sophistication that Freud brought to the problems of psychological description and treatment. I do want to suggest, as is obvious from the way I'm going at this, however, that the limitations are such, have proved themselves such, that we can no longer look to psychoanalysis with the same confidence we did, say, 30 years ago, for central answers to the way we work, even though we will always be informed, it seems to me, by psychoanalytic ideas and by fresh interpretations of what Freud meant, which are so various. What he meant is so various and so interesting, and therefore endlessly fertilizing our efforts. The analytic project, of course, rested upon the same criticism of descriptive psychotic I just given. It rested on the criticism that you simply couldn't find out about people by asking them. That was all what Freud called secondary process. And he didn't just discourage it, he simply dismissed it. And he replaced it, you remember, first by an hypnotic investigation, which he found flawed in turn, and then by the method of free associations. And above all, by a settled mode of working, very much modeled on the surgical laboratory, or the laboratory in general. The idea of repeated, similar sessions, predictable, in which the patient is kept out of sight to some extent, in which the fundamental rule of analysis is applied, say whatever comes to mind, and a great body of free associated material collected as the data for this, you could almost say, experiment on the patient as an object. His discoveries under this procedure, of course, are well known to us, and I won't repeat any of them, except to say that the very procedure itself, and this is such a good sign of the reflective nature of his work and of his sophistication psychologically, of course, the very procedure itself generated a whole new conception of what both treatment and the recognition of disease would consist of. That was the concept of transference. That is, that in fact, as we all know, that given certain conditions, in many cases, the infantile neurosis, as it was called, would surface on the person of the therapist or analyst. And that the deepest understanding of human nature that analysis proposed to reach was, in fact, this very surfacing of the infantile neurosis in the form of the transference neurosis. So here was an effort to circumvent the obvious limitations of direct interrogations and orders, or even of direct observation. Here was an effort to circumvent it by setting up a situation in which the psychological could manifest itself. And that model, which had no competition, and still in many ways has no competition in terms of its clarity, directness, and good sense, serves as the foundation of our respect, it seems to me, for psychoanalysis as both a psychological and a therapeutic effort. Nevertheless, psychoanalysis proved a better laboratory method than a therapeutic method. And indeed, I think this is a reflection of Freud's own interests, which were never in therapy particularly. And there are many instances where he dismissed patients very abruptly in order to return to the investigation of another more interesting patient. And we can be thankful of that, even though it may seem cold-hearted to us who are perhaps more therapeutic types. But the project was throughout modeled on the laboratory or on the surgical amphitheater, and therefore was investigative in its thrust, in keeping with Freud's extraordinary personal investigative zeal. Remember, he thought of himself as a conquistador, among other things. Now, this procedure, of course, proved, when applied to therapy, when applied to a long-term resolution of what it discovered, enormously expensive and cumbersome. So cumbersome and expensive, and so doubtful in its outcome, that the questions began early and continued to accumulate about its therapeutic place. In my own mind, there's no question that it has great value as a way of students of psychology learning about themselves and about life and about psychology. But as to its general therapeutic application, I think we have to raise the gravest doubts. And I say that as someone who received a psychoanalytic education in Boston and is a faculty member of one of these institutes. Furthermore, studies of the effects of psychoanalysis therapeutically have not given it an edge over much less cumbersome and expensive procedures. And there is simply no exception to that I know of in the whole literature of psychotherapy evaluation. Furthermore, as we all know so well, almost from the beginning, psychoanalysis divided into schools, which alerts us to something I think that psychoanalysis itself had great difficulty acknowledging, and which you will see how I deal with very shortly. The fact that psychoanalysis could break so rapidly into schools and continue to break into schools was not only a sign of its growth, but also of its lack of integration. And I think its lack of integration was a function of what I will talk about later, its failure to acknowledge the central place of perspective and differing perspectives in the whole psychological enterprise. But it left psychoanalysis divided against itself, as it still is. I don't need to review here, it's been done over and over again, almost ad nauseum, the scientific limitations from the point of view of laboratory science of psychoanalysis. But to me, the most compelling criticism from a scientific point of view and a general history of ideas point of view is that Freud, in my opinion, sold his invention to the medical profession partly by bootlegging in a series of biological metaphors. And we all know them, instinct, forces, and the rest. And that made it enormously appealing, particularly to the medical mind, psychoanalysis. Now, I say bootlegging, not because he wasn't sincere, because he himself, as a neurologist and a pharmacologist in his beginnings, was very sincere about his biological interest. But bootlegging in the sense that these are not really physical ideas. You cannot talk about force in chemistry or physics without specifying a method of measuring it. Otherwise it remains like phlogiston or the ether, a superstition which is useful to bridge conceptual difficulties, but which in the long run has to be abandoned because it cannot be measured. And force in psychoanalysis, the concept of force in psychoanalysis is simply unmeasured, or libido, or the various forms it takes. It's simply unmeasured. And that leaves it conceptually not just squishy, you might say, but really absent, vacant. I also think that psychoanalysis has suffered from something which we all suffer from, and which is the price of time. I know when I came into the work, and it was the reason I went to medical school, because Freud had fascinated me in college. When I came into psychoanalysis and into psychoanalytic training, I was disappointed because it had lost the excitement that it once had. I knew too much of it. Now, I don't mean I knew it therapeutically or experienced it fully, but in terms of its liveliness and originality and interest, it was dying. Now, I don't hold that against psychoanalysis. Every set of ideas dies. Every set of ideas petrifies. Every set of ideas is eventually, makes the extraordinary trip which I remember making once from the idea of Jesus, which struck me as an extraordinary idea, to the Vatican Museum. And if you've ever done that, either in reality or in your imagination, gone from the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Poverty, the Prince of Self-Abnegation, the Prince essentially of self-crucifixion almost, to the Vatican Museum, which is one of the great booty centers, one of the great centers of the collection of wealth, power, and conquest of other peoples that the world has ever seen. You see what happens eventually, perhaps to all ideas. And this is what's happened to psychoanalysis. Now, this would only be a historical curiosity, except for something which is essentially vital and which really animates what I'm going to try to interest you in. And that is that we really have to have fresh ways of talking about things. Because if we don't have fresh ways of talking about it, the psychological enterprise, by definition, is defeated. Because unless one can come to people, not with a sense of imposing familiar and perhaps petrified notions on them, but of somehow finding together things that in fact represent their uniqueness and aliveness, unless one can do that, the therapeutic enterprise, in my opinion, is defeated. So in that sense, we all have to reinvent psychotherapy as we practice it. But since none of us have the capacity to reinvent it altogether, we depend upon each other to supply us with the kind of living ingredients which can make it a living experience. Now I say that with great respect for psychoanalysis because for a long time, for 100 years essentially, psychoanalysis has been giving us the life stuff of therapeutic work in psychiatry, in my opinion, and its various offshoots and corollaries. But I think it needs a recasting, not in every respect, but a recasting and a placing of its particular method in a more limited, although useful place for special cases, and its investigative zeal and capacity recognized, but a somewhat fresher perspective brought to bear so that we in our work have the opportunity to do what was done with the invention itself of psychoanalysis. Now, what I propose to do is to try to discuss psychotherapy and psychological observation from a purely psychological point of view, without, as I say, bootlegging in physicalistic concepts, like disease itself, of course, and remaining within the nature of the psychological. Now, if you're like me, you have been puzzled for a long time about what we mean by the term psychological. And maybe only a psychiatrist, that is someone educated in medical school, would have so much difficulty. And those of you who were educated psychologically or in other ways may have long since reached the point that I'm at and perhaps surpassed it. But for me, it has always been a mystery. Psychiatry is a living, or sometimes living, example of the difficulties of what we mean by psychological, because obviously psycho is in the term, indeed is the leading part of the term psychological, as is true of psychoanalytic, as is true of psychosomatic, as is true of psychology itself. And yet I find in psychiatric discussions almost no sense of what is meant by the psychological. So that is the first question that I want to try to answer. What do we mean by the psychological? Now, I think the psychological is the effort to be objective about the subjective. It is the effort to be objective, relatively objective about the subject. Now, what do we mean by the subjective? I think what we mean by the subjective is the way we see, the individual sees and feels things. It is the perspective, the point of view, the outlook that constitutes the material of psychological work. Each of us stares forth, you might say, from an individually shaped, genetically different nervous system, which is looking at the world from this point of view that no one else has ever or will ever have. That is our subjectivity. In other words, our position is unique. Unique, not very unique or almost unique or polyunique or all those things we're not supposed to say, but in fact unique. So the psychological enterprise proposes to be as objective as it can about this overriding subjectivity. Second of all, we are to a considerable extent sealed within our subjectivities, our perspectives. We are sealed within them. And I don't know what moment in your lives announced to you, perhaps, for the first time, sometimes for people the last time, that in fact other people don't see it the same way you do. Those of you who are better students of the child development literature must be able to speak to that extraordinary moment of the birth of the awareness of the psychological. Most often we see it in what are called arguments, in which we discover that something that seems perfectly obvious to us has no meaning or a completely contrary meaning to someone else. Most often that discovery is greeted by a derogation. Someone is called mental or stupid. And the disagreement is dismissed as not constituting a separate point of view, but simply a facet of sickness or ignorance. And that way of dealing with the psychological, the way of dealing with contrary perspectives is so widespread that actual respect in the sense of putting on equal plane others' perspectives and your own constitutes an exception in human affairs. These things are easier to say now because we have an outlook in our own work which is, thank God, enormously improved by the awareness that women might have a somewhat different perspective. Some women might have a different perspective from some men, etc., races, groups, or whatever. Literature and art, it seems to me, are celebrations of perspective. Is one reason why they are often shocking, especially new art, because it sees things differently. And furthermore, it can only see them, it places them before us. But the way in which the sealedness of perspectives comes to us therapists most poignantly is in what have usually been referred to as repetitions. When we see people of intelligence, goodwill, hopefulness, nevertheless going on doing something or going on seeing something in a way that seems utterly unaffected by its disastrousness or by our efforts or by any interchange. So that we then see that not only are people sealed within those perspectives, but those perspectives themselves are packed tight, you might say. There isn't a lot of room in many of them for much movement. Now the aspect of the psychological and of perspectives that seems to be most extraordinary is what I want to discuss next. This can be put in a number of ways, but the most succinct way, in my mind, is to say that the subjective is capable of taking itself as an object. The subject is capable of taking itself as an object. Now, what do I mean by that? The most common word used to describe this phenomenon is consciousness. When we mean by consciousness not simply our responsiveness or our reflexive aliveness to the world, but our awareness of the way we see the world, of our thoughts and feelings about the world. That is the subject taking itself, its own way of seeing the world, as an object. Soon we come to see, particularly those of us who are very self-conscious, conscious of our perspectives, or try to be conscious of our perspectives. Those who are like that, soon come to see that we have a particular perspective. It's by no means homogeneous, it's by no means clearly defined, but it's a particular perspective, and it's a perspective that may be marked in certain ways that we call sick, for example. It may be a depressive perspective, or a split perspective, or an absence of any particular perspective at all, shifting, as you often see in chronic psychotic people. Or it may be a perspective marked by that most extraordinary radical change in perspective, which is called dissociation. So that one goes from clicking on and off a different point of view. And then when we look at the phenomena of dreams, some of us would say that dreams are the clearest picture, literally picture, or sometimes sounds and kinesthesias of our perspective. Because a dream is our looking at the world without objects to interfere or distort our perspective. Simply the way we see things. And that can be, in a Freudian sense, a conflicted and self-centered seeing, or, for example, in the Jungian sense, it can be like a flash of lightning, the way in which, in fact, we see our perspective on the world. One of the fruits of psychoanalysis has been to show us, paradoxically, the strength of the Jungian dream concept, often in such a way that you will speak to people who have had analyses, and they will tell you they had a dream in the analysis which was simply a picture of the way they saw the world. One of my favorite examples is something from the existential literature, although it came out of a psychoanalysis, in which a woman dreamed that she was in a refrigerator, inside a refrigerator, in a boxcar at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And she had been, for all practical purposes, a seemingly cheerful, well-adjusted individual. But as the scrutiny of her life and her perspective developed, it became clear that she was cold, unloved, alone, to an extraordinary extent, that this dream, which came to her like a flash of lightning, illuminating the inner world through which she saw the inner prism through which she saw the world, and which seemed utterly disguised from the affable and smiling person that she otherwise presented. Now, the final one of these propositions I want to suggest to you is that how we take others and ourselves as object is a definition or another statement of what perspective is. How I see myself, how I see you, is my perspective. Now, what do we mean by that? How I see it? How does, in fact, what are the options of the development of perspective, crudely as we understand them? What are the kind of options of the development of perspective have people noticed? Those of you who have looked at the writings of Lacan, or the commentary on Lacan, will have noticed that one of the dramatic moments in the development of that man's thought, interesting thought it seems to me in many respects, is what he called the mirror stage, in which the young person, or the old person, but the person first seeing themselves in a mirror, thinks they have seen themselves. Now, is that a perspective? It can become a perspective, and this is Lacan's point. It can become a perspective if you decide that is who you are. That smiling or scowling, handsome, ugly, confident, frightened figure that you thought you saw in the mirror. Don't forget, you never see yourself in the mirror. What you see is yourself looking at yourself in the mirror. So right away, the reflexive taking of yourself as an object is affecting the way you look. Some of us do not like to look in mirrors. Or some of us, when we look in mirrors, look in them fleetingly. Others of us treasure mirrors. Happy are the souls that treasure being photographed and being mirrored. You look at the Kennedys, for example. They grew up somehow always ready to be photographed. But the way in which we take that image as ourself is one way of beginning to understand our perspective. Now, Lacan was interested in this particularly because he thought it contributed to a basic misunderstanding about human beings, this mirror experience. That is, it allowed you to think you knew yourself. Look, there I am. Isn't that me? You know? And for me, that is a very interesting idea because it's one of the reasons I think that the physical has such a power in people's minds. Because the first time they meet themselves as flesh, nose, hair. And that, they think, is themselves. Furthermore, as they go around, as I used to do as a boy in the subways of New York, being startled by the fact I never saw any two people that looked alike. Indeed, not only are our perspectives independent and unique, but so, for the most part, are our faces. But Lacan was offended by the idea that anyone should be led into the conviction that they saw themselves, that they met themselves in the mirror, when in fact what they are meeting after a little while, after you begin to form an image and ideas about them, is your perspective, of course, on yourself. What do we say? How do I look today? See the complexity of that. How do I look? What is my look at my perspective, and how is my perspective today? Am I cheerful or whatever? Winnicott is of interest to us in this regard, as and of course in so many others too. Winnicott is of interest to us because he is interested in the way perspective develops in relationship, not as Lacan was in relationship to oneself. That is Lacan's interest, but now in relationship, say, to the mother. And you recall he developed the now familiar idea that the mother can sometimes allow the child to be alone in the mother's presence, that is, to express their individual spontaneous gestures and what he called true self, and therefore allow the emergence of their own perspective. Or, of course, the mother may continually intrude so that the perspective of the child is essentially overborne by various ideas that become internalized in that perspective from the parent. And that carries you very quickly to the most popular form of contemporary psychoanalysis, which is object relations, which is the story of the impact of the object on the perspective in a historical and pathological sense. So I form a perspective on myself, which is by no means homogeneous, as I say, or easily defined, although it may have features, at least, that seem, if not constant, at least reiterative. I also form an opinion of you. Soon I do not see you anymore. Soon I see you as the way I imagine you, or the way I've come to believe you are, or something of that kind. And then I discover that perhaps I do not allow myself to see you at all. Perhaps I am frightened that if I really am in contact with you, you will overpower me. And then I discover that the way in which I take myself as an object is very much dominated, not only by depression, elation, and various other features, but also by freedom and slavery. I never tire of mentioning to people that the reason that a display like the one I'm making before you today is tolerable is that you are not imprisoned by it, I hope. You are free to think about other things. You are free to put on your faces, moderate attention, probably hide some of your indifference or critical concerns, while meantime your mind goes about its own business. And that, I think, is the most important freedom human beings have. In other words, the freedom not to take me as an object, not to take me at all, to ignore me utterly. And notice that that's very much what Winnicott was celebrating in the happy child's relationship to its mother. The kid doesn't have to pay attention to the mother at all. To hell with her, and goes on about its own development of its own thinking and feeling and the rest of it. Classrooms, of course, can be thought of as kind of, what would be a metaphor for the classroom in this phenomenon? They are sort of occasions for submission or freedom, aren't they? Do I agree or don't I agree? Can I think my own thoughts, or do I have to believe things the way this person tells me I should believe them? That's so that the classroom is a kind of a crossroads in everybody's life, in which opportunities of obedience and freedom, independence and submission, etc., are offered or denied. And I'll come back to that at the very end of these remarks this morning. And then, of course, the same issue of freedom and slavery becomes part of the way I take myself as an object. There's a wonderful moment in one of Joseph Conrad's letters when he's writing to his aunt by marriage. He's also a novelist, a Polish novelist. And in this letter, he's berating this lady because he thinks she gives herself much too generously to ungrateful people. And he buzzes on about this at considerable length, and hoping that she will really take better care of herself and not pay so much attention to these ungrateful people to whom she has enslaved herself on many occasions. And then he proudly, in his sort of mixture of boyishness and grandeur, which is a feature of Conrad, he proudly announces to her, "I am the equal of my conscience," he said. "I am the equal of my conscience." Well, there is my point at a moment of freedom, where someone says, "I do not have to do what my conscience tells me. I know that my conscience came from this one and that one, from this church and that church, and from that parental injunction and that teacher's insistence. I know it. I am going to be the equal of it and judge it myself." Now that's a statement of the way in which Joseph Conrad took himself, part of himself called his conscience, as an object, i.e. took it as an object for scrutiny. Took it as an object that he did not have to surrender to. Well, these incidental remarks about the way we take others and ourselves as objects are meant to be illustrations of the kind of relationships that perspectives set up within themselves and to others. But above all, they are meant to underline the basic point of these remarks just now, that we are sealed within our perspectives. Those perspectives form certain relatively consistent, even repetitive ways, and they are the way in which psychologically we structure our world. Now, in the rest of these remarks, I want to suggest the ways in which such a perspective on perspectives, or a psychological view of our work, leads us to certain assumptions about the interview. I'm embarrassed to say that the title of this talk, as originally given, was The Principles of Interviewing. You see how here I was trying to avoid that very tone, right? And fell plump into the middle of it. So it should be some principles of interviewing, or an occasional principle of interviewing, or something that more bespeaks the tentative nature of all these efforts, not only mine. So if what we meet is a perspective, and we meet it with our own perspective, then the interview has the curious character of two sealed beings approaching each other, taking each other as objects in the ways characteristic of their perspectives. What does that mean about the interview? Well, it must put us off. It must be even annoying to think that we should have to complicate our already difficult work by such almost indefinable kind of gropings as that suggests. So let me suggest a recommendation for even something that I hope I can make clearer, but something so apparently arcane. The recommendations toward the interview that are embodied in descriptive work in psychoanalysis have, it seems to me, a feature in them which what I'm suggesting does not have, a feature which I think is profoundly misleading about the nature of our relationships with each other, and about the opportunities we want to have to get at something which we can respect more in the way of findings. See, both the method of questions and answers of descriptive psychiatry and the expectant waiting for associations in psychoanalysis, both of them have a secret agenda. An agenda, however, which is not so secret that the patient doesn't sense it. And the agenda is that I, who am asking you questions, I'm going to find out the disease you have. I'm going to uncover it. And if I'm very subtle, even the lies you tell me, even the lies you tell me to hide, right? Even those will alert me to the nature of your disease. And psychoanalysis is the same way. As I listen in silence, I am seeking for what? Unconscious themes, slips, distortions. And you soon know that. So that in both cases, patient and therapist are pitted against each other. The patient pretending or colluding or even exaggerating what he thinks or she thinks the therapist might want to know and uncover. And the therapist, analyst, unmasking. So that all the findings of both descriptive psychiatry and psychoanalysis fall under the heavy charge of being distorted by the patient and therapist being pitted against each other in this game of pretending or unmasking. So that my first recommendation for what I'm suggesting is that I think a genuine concern for perspective, a genuinely democratic acknowledgement of the meeting of separate and unique perspectives saves us to some extent from this deeply distorting and pathology creating, to some extent, game of unmasking. Now, first of all remarks about interviewing, I think, have to start out, with what we learn in life. Because many of us are much better interviewers in everyday life than we are when we're with a patient. Because we're freer then to use our good sense, to move from meeting to acquaintanceship to friendship. And to do that, think for a moment of what it's like to make a friend. And I mean by that, if you can forgive my thinking, I know what this is, a real friend. That is someone with whom one can be both close and open. Close and open. Now, the combination of closeness and openness in human affairs is not to be recommended. It is not to be recommended. It is a Darwinian mistake. Because if you're in the jungle, if you're close to someone or something, you want to be sure you're not too open. And if you're open, you want to be sure you have a distance from them. And that jungle, of course, is everywhere, isn't it? I recommend Harvard as a exercise in the anatomy of jungles. So, what friendship depends upon is the development of friendship depends upon something which is a kind of chemical affinity, like love, isn't it? Which means that the people feel the same way about a lot of things. Now, feelings, as I will elaborate much more in the next lecture, are very much connected with the structure of a perspective. So that when we have the same feelings about things, we have a overlapping, at least, of perspectives that is experienced as an extraordinary thing. It doesn't mean that you're safe, but it means your chances of safety have increased. Now, I think that's the kind of way I think we should think about the interview. And one of the ways I'm saying this is that the other schools have sort of deconventionalized the interview. They've sort of taken away your common sense about how you approach people and replaced it with a kind of formal routine procedure. And I suggest that much of that is seriously mistaken. And we'll go at that at more length next time, when I'm going to speak about the interview as an experience, not the title that's in the list. Actual interviewing depends upon many things, but in a general way, quite apart from the recommendations I'm going to make, it depends upon clinical tact, timing, and this special affinity of feeling, which I've described. And one of the things that marks us as therapists or people interested in therapy is that we are prepared to have a flexibility of feeling which allows us to simulate friendship to some extent with people that it might not arise in spontaneously. I'll talk about clinical tact in the third of these talks, and I'll talk about timing in the fourth. And I don't think I'll ever be brave enough to talk about feeling with the attention it obviously deserves. Now, the first principle, beyond these central principles of tact and timing and the rest, the first principle I want to recommend that falls out of the concept of perspectives in interviewing is that the patient is assumed to be well until proved sick. The patient is assumed first to be well. Now remember, we're talking about unique perspectives meeting each other. And the assumption that the patient's perspective is wrong or sick is something that we have, in my opinion, no warrant to make under any circumstance. So we apply the principle of law, which is that you're innocent until proved guilty, rather than the current perspective, which is that you're sick until proved well. Now, this is a foundation stone, in my opinion, of a sensible approach to the problems of interviewing in therapy. And I want to, at some length now, I hope it not too tiresome a length, to elaborate why this is a sound assumption that you're well rather than sick. And if I had more time and you had more patience, I would talk a lot about the history of our ideas about the average sickness of people, which have changed a lot, and which in some parts of psychoanalysis are seen as ubiquitous, that we're all sick, even though in parts of Freud you could read as we're all well. But the attitude has been, I think, can it be because we need to drum up business? I mean, that's not a bad reason. I mean, the dentists are talking about their caries, and everybody has the things they need to. I won't give you my own adventures in that kind of experience, but it's been true of electricians and plumbers in my life, and everybody else pretty much in our commercial culture. But this issue of sickness versus health is so central that I want to, as I say, spend some time saying why I think it's epistemologically, scientifically, much more sensible to say people are well until proved sick. First of all our terms of sickness are vague. If you can give me something that separates sadness from depression in a decisive way, I will do what I can to support your livelihood henceforth. I don't think it's possible. Even such fundamental notions in schizophrenia as dissociation of speech or autism are very difficult to distinguish from ordinary, normal functioning of human minds. And even if we had much more decisive concepts, which I think psychologically we cannot have, we have no tests, no quantitative tests, or even physical tests of any kind in order to indicate that something is present or is not present. One of the advantages of having gone to medical school, and there are many disadvantages, but one of the advantages of having gone is that you realize how the medical mind works when it's working. Medicine can be very theoretical as we are, and you can hear the endocrinologists arguing about whether it's the adrenals or the thyroid. But then someone comes in and says, look at the laboratory slip. And the whole argument is over. Not forever, but at least for a while. This is thyroid disease. We can see there. And that is a procedure that simply does not happen in our work. Furthermore, we know our conditions can be simulated. Many of you remember that famous article in Science where a group of volunteers were trained. They didn't have to be trained very much to present themselves at the doors of mental hospitals, to which they were almost immediately admitted. In those days, it was easier to get in than it is now. They were admitted. Furthermore, they were not discharged. It was hard to get out. And the people that knew best that they were simulated were only the patients. The staff was comparatively easy to fool. Now that experiment, to my knowledge, has not been repeated in such a careful way. But anyone who has worked in our emergency rooms, in our hospitals, especially when the weather gets bad, or the criminal justice system, which is a wonderful term, criminal justice system gets working, right, knows that simulation is every poor person's privilege, in dealing with a social system which gives them no opportunity to defend themselves in other ways. Furthermore, when we are not deceiving other people, we are deceiving ourselves. That is, if nothing else, the central message of psychoanalysis, self-deception. So that the fact that I could turn to you for some idea about your sickness is an extraordinary idea. Furthermore, I believe there is a paradox of what I call a paradox of self-disclosure. And I don't know whether this is simply an idiosyncratic experience I have with people, but I find that the generous people I know think of themselves as stingy, while the stingy people I know announce to me over and over again how generous they are. And the people that are, I suspect, although I don't know quite what the word means, the so-called narcissistic types, those people don't think they're narcissistic at all. In fact, they find themselves quite the soul of modesty. And if you knew them better, you would celebrate them even more than you do already. Right? While the people that call themselves narcissistic, and I hear it all the time because we all use those terms, the people that call themselves, in my opinion, are quite the opposite. They seem terribly modest, self-concerned, self-abnegating, and the farthest thing from narcissistic in the sense of loving themselves. So, self-disclosure as a ground of deciding that someone is sick strikes me as the shadiest of enterprises. And finally, one of the reasons why I think the assumption of health over sickness and before sickness is so sound is that this medicalization of psychiatry that has gone on rests on a deeply fraudulent base. And I'm not speaking of the disease concept, although that's a very queasy concept in psychiatry. Those of you who have not read textbooks of medicine, as I did for much longer than I wish I had, and know what medicine means by disease, in the range of phenomena that's implicit in a disease, that is the physical findings, the incidence, the pathogenesis, the treatment, the definition of things along a great many categories, knows that we have almost no diseases, if any. We have nothing that will really fill that up in a compelling way. But that's not what I mean by the fraudulence of the medicalization of psychiatry. The real fraud occurs at the bedside. Because when you are a medical doctor, what you do is you take a history and you do a physical. And just as soon as you do a physical, you discover something which has to be celebrated. And in most relationships between the doctor and patient is celebrated. That is, you discover that most of the patient is functioning very well. I, who came to my doctor, confident I was dying, confident that my nervous system had given out years ago and that my heart was only waiting to collapse after it, discover after a rudimentary physical that I'm really working very well. And furthermore, it isn't an impression the doctor forms on the basis of kind of mystical notions of health. It's based simply on the fact that all my reflexes work, or that my pulse is right, or that I'm not blue, or something of that sort. In other words, the tests of normality and abnormality in the physical examination are clear, definite, repeatable, and numerous. And if that's not good enough news, the laboratory tests come back, and most of them are fine. So that even when I see myself as really very decrepit, and perhaps I am in some respects, and even after I'm dead, for God's sake, even after they've pronounced me dead, I go on growing. My hair, my nails won't stop. So that in terms of an overall account of me, and then the ethicists are going to argue forever about whether I'm dead when my brain goes, or my heart goes, or my lungs go, or my nails. I mean, if our nails depended upon it, my God, there wouldn't be a filled cemetery in America. All we do in the psychological examination is to announce what's wrong with the person. And we say, well, they're not deluded. But that's hardly a vote of confidence. And in other words, there's no kind of positive accretion of a sense of strength. I've suggested at length elsewhere that we can have tests of connectedness and self-protection in the psychological examination, but they have made no inroads in the actual procedure as it's practiced. It's true that the neurologists bring in various tests of memory and apperception, which one can say are positive or negative. But in the psychological field, we have literally nothing to guide us. So for that reason, I'm saying it is a much safer assumption of health rather than of sickness. Furthermore, of course, that assumption gains from the fact that we speak out of a unique perspective. This individually shaped, genetically different view that we have on the world by ourselves alone. Now, the honoring of perspectives also is my next point about interviewing, should extend to honoring our own perspectives toward the patient. And this, it seems to me, has very has very sharp effects. Because in much recommending about interviews, we are told to be neutral, for example. Or if we're Rogerians, we're told to have unconditional positive regard. Now that seems to me a great mistake, both of those. Because one of the ways, and we'll talk more about this next time, one of the ways by which I know what your perspective is by allowing myself to feel it, have the natural responses in my own body and in my own feelings that are encountered by meeting it. That's the way I know, one of the ways I begin to know about your perspective. And in contrast, if I insist upon being neutral, or being always upbeat about you in some fashion, I'm simply not allowing myself to respond to the other person in a natural way. Now later on I will say that of course we have to have perspective on our own perspective on the patient. But that doesn't mean we can afford not to have our initial responses to the patient fall upon us as a receiving organism, as an organism which allows itself to hate, to love, to feel about the person we're in the presence of, not only because we feel that way, but also because that's a way we find out about what their perspective and what they are like. A point that may be helpful in understanding comes out of painting, in which the concept of linear perspective means that by distinctness, size, and color, you are allowed to determine how far away an object looks. So that when we add to our perspectives the need for a therapeutic linear perspective, which allows us to see our own feelings at some distance, like an out-of-body experience, then we can get a little more sense of why it's all right to allow ourselves, can be all right to allow ourselves to feel. Now I want to close this out by saying quickly that all these things must leave you, very uncertain as to what I'm up to in a systematic way. You might have a sense of what I'm against, but it must be hard to know what I'm in favor of. And I want to begin, and that will be what everything else is about anyway, but let me begin to give you more sense of what it is I'm not just against, but what I think is promising about seeing the interview in these ways. Of course, I could say, well, we want to improve the other person's perspective, enlarge it, understand it, shift it, stop it from being so inflexible. All those things would be certainly good sense, and we'll get around to talking about that kind of thing. But we really want something more concrete, I think, than that, to conduct an interview. That's a little vague. We want something like what the descriptive psychiatrists give us or what the analysts give us. Because they tell us, these orthodoxies, these classical schools, they tell us what we're supposed to listen for. And thank God for that. Many's the time when I've been utterly at sea in what I was doing in my own work, when I could think to myself, well, I'm just listening. I'm just waiting for the red thread of the unconscious to pop out of the tapestry, and therefore I don't have to do anything. Furthermore, I don't have to be nervous, and I can even charge my fee because I'm doing something that is eminently, at least it used to be, respectable. We know what the objective descriptive, the disease people are looking for. They're looking for symptoms and signs leading to symptoms and leading to diseases. We know what the analysts are listening for, this red thread of the unconscious themes, the distortions, the slips. We know what to listen for. And without that, how could we go about our business? What am I saying? What does this psychological view of the interview ask us to listen for? I suggest it asks us to listen for two things. First of all, it asks us to listen for what everyone else is listening for. Errors, mistakes, sins, sickness. But to listen for them in this way, to listen for the voice in ourselves which says, that guy's crazy. Or, boy, that fellow's offbeat. Or how inappropriate. What I want us to do is to have us record that news, so to speak, that is in us. In other words, transform it from, you are crazy, to, that makes me feel like you're crazy. Now, what good is that doing us? Well, let me suggest what good that will do us. There's a moment, apparently, in the educational theory of teaching mathematics, which goes something like this. The teacher says to the child, which is bigger, 1/4 or 1/3? The child says 1/4, of course. And the teacher says, that's wrong. A wiser teacher says, why did you think 1/4 is bigger than 1/3? And the child answers, perhaps you can guess, because 4 is bigger than 3. Well, that 4 is bigger than 3. They got something right? But there's something in the theory of fractions that has so far escaped their perspective, right? So that teacher, which hears themselves saying what they say on the playgrounds, you're mental, you're sick, you shouldn't be part of the gang, that response in ourselves is now recognized as a response, certainly, and a signal that our perspective and the patient's perspective are different. In other words, we look for those moments of disjunction, which we announce by the words sickness, crazy, wrong, as signs that our perspectives are different. And that becomes the signal for us trying to figure out how we can narrow that perspective difference down. The way the teacher does by saying, oh yeah, 4 is bigger than 3, and now let's think about something else, right? So rather than closing it down, that becomes a signal that our perspective is different from the other person's, and that something has to be done to see if we can narrow that difference. And I think one way of looking at the therapeutic process is how many things you have to do to bring the two perspectives together. That doesn't mean that your perspective's right and theirs is wrong. They're both unique, but it means that in order for them to talk together, something has to happen, probably in both perspectives. And as we all know, one of the joys of our work is that we get as much treatment as the patients. It's cheaper, And that, so that you could think of the length of the procedure as crudely measured by the amount of energy and ingenuity that's going to be required to bring our perspectives into some kind of harmony. Now there's a second thing I think we're listening for, and I think it's possible to see that this is the other side of the error coin. I think we are listening for the unexpected. We are listening also for the unexpected. Errors and mistakes, that's not unexpected for us. But we are listening for something else, the unexpected, even the surprising. Now that is systematically necessary, I will argue, because if the other person's perspective is unique, we should not be able to understand it. It should, when it finally begins to dawn on us, it should surprise us. Now when I began to think about this, I realized that it explains something that had always puzzled me. And it's in one of Freud's lectures on the recommendations for the practice of psychoanalysis, in which he says that the best cases are those in which the physician, the analyst, is surprised in the course of the treatment. Now I thought what he meant was what the scientist investigator he was would mean, which is that he had had an aha experience. And to some extent that may be true. But I think from a therapeutic point of view, what he was recording was that this experience of surprise meant that this unique perspective had come into view. And your surprise is because you never saw anything like it before. And in fact, you never did. So that unless we have that experience of the unexpected, we probably are not in touch with the patient. We are probably simply responding to the patient by cliches, borderline, depressed, Oedipus complex, or whatever those coins rubbed so smooth by so many years tell us to say. Now I think that these two things, error and surprise or unexpectedness, are the opposite sides of the same coin. Because when we allow ourselves to remain open to the unexpected, we have not closed down by the proclamation of error. And just as when we try to take our response, our reflex, that's wrong or that's crazy, and live with it and narrow it, then we come upon the unexpected. So I think the two of them may be different sides of the same coin. I'm going to close with that in just one footnote. I forgot to mention in the course of this that something that I think is important for us, especially in this self-psychological era, in this existential era. I've been talking about perspectives. remember that the existential and phenomenological project was to get rid of perspectives. That is, it was Binswanger, Jaspers, and the rest of them wanted to put the world between brackets, so that all the different points of view, perspectives from which you came at things, were put aside, and you saw the person for what they really were. That was the claim. It's also a Buddhist claim sometimes, Zen Buddhist claim sometimes. Now, I don't believe that's possible. I do not believe there is a way to transcend psychology. So in that sense, I find myself impatient, although I can understand why they would not want, the existentialist, phenomenological, and perhaps some others, they would not want to be stuck within this perspectivism. And it may well be that I'm not understanding Zen Buddhism when I say that, and I see one or two people here who could put me straight.